A millionaire with everything to lose and a waitress with nothing left to give, an impossible contract, a ticking clock, and a connection they never saw coming. When Margaret Bennett accepts Jordan Carter's unusual proposal, she steps into a world of secrets, lies, and unexpected love that will change both of their lives forever. Jordan Carter had everything most people dream of, but ironically, he lived in a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. His luxurious penthouse, right in the heart of bustling New York City, felt less like a home and more like a gilded cage. Behind velvet curtains and crystal chandeliers, Jordan hid a man trapped in endless meetings and million-dollar decisions. It was clear that the absurd amount of money in his bank account couldn't buy what he was avoiding the most: real human connections. Alone, he buried himself in work as if trying to escape something far bigger than any contract he could sign. Meanwhile, miles away, Margaret Bennett's life was hanging by a thread. She worked as a waitress, juggling trays, fake smiles, and the humiliation that had become a constant in her job. Her manager, always in a foul mood, never hesitated to spit out harsh words, and the meager tips barely covered her overdue rent. Everything around her felt like it was falling apart. The threat of eviction was as real as the air she breathed, pressing down on her chest. And yet, Margaret was one of those people who knew how to hide behind a mask of resilience. She smiled even when life threw her into a whirlwind of unexpected twists and turns. To the restaurant customers, she was the cheerful, helpful waitress. But deep down, there was a storm brewing. A storm of doubts, hopelessness, and the echoes of a past filled with abandoned dreams. Jordan, on the other hand, refused to even acknowledge his past. It was easier to ignore the memories of a lonely childhood and the emptiness left by an emotionally distant family. He approached life the same way he approached contracts. Everything had to be straightforward, calculated, and devoid of unnecessary emotions. Human connections? To him, they were nothing more than distractions. The two of them couldn't have imagined that their paths were about to collide, like puzzle pieces that fate insisted on putting together. Margaret had no idea her life was on the brink of changing in ways she couldn't begin to comprehend. And Jordan? He was about to discover that money can't fix everything, especially the kind of loneliness that lives deep in your heart. At the restaurant where Margaret worked, the days blended together like pages of a book she'd rather not read. Until one day, her manager exploded at her, calling her useless and replaceable in front of everyone. The shame burned hot, but the feeling of powerlessness was worse. She didn't know that, on that very day, a completely unexpected proposal would be waiting for her. Jordan, meanwhile, sat in his office, staring at the phone, typing and erasing numbers. He knew he needed to find someone to help care for his ailing grandmother, but his pride and fear held him back. He had his own demons to battle, but what unsettled him most was having to make a choice that wasn't purely logical, something human. As Margaret walked back to her tiny apartment that evening, the manager's cruel words echoed in her mind, alongside the pile of bills on her table and the eviction notice pinned to the door. Yet she didn't know that her life was about to take a sharp turn. Jordan made the call. The wheels of fate were already in motion, and neither of them had any idea just how much their lives were about to change. Jordan Carter was a man of numbers and contracts, someone who believed that emotions only complicated things. For him, everything could be reduced to terms on paper, clear, binding, and free of unpredictability. So when his grandmother's health took a turn for the worse, Jordan knew he had to hire someone to care for her. But he had one condition: whoever he hired would agree to a strict contract that eliminated any chance of emotional involvement. A professional solution to a deeply personal problem. On the other side of the city, Margaret Bennett was holding her life together by a thread. That day, after being humiliated by her manager in front of the entire restaurant, she had never felt smaller. Her pride was crushed, her options non-existent. Bills piled up on her kitchen table like a taunt, and eviction was no longer a threat, it was a promise. So when her phone buzzed with an unknown number that evening, the last thing she expected was an offer that sounded more like a twisted fairy tale than reality. The call came from an assistant of Jordan's, cold and to the point. "We have a proposal for you. High pay, long hours. Non-negotiable terms." Margaret froze, suspicious of something that seemed too good to be true. "Why me?" she asked cautiously. "Because your situation makes you the perfect candidate," the voice replied. The words stung. Whoever this man was, he clearly saw her as nothing more than an opportunity. But desperation left little room for dignity. Margaret hesitated. The idea of leaving her life, even the miserable version of it, behind to step into an arrangement like this terrified her. What kind of person made an offer like this? And what kind of woman would say yes? Yet the seed had been planted. As she lay in bed that night, the numbers replayed in her mind. The kind of money being offered was life-changing, the kind that could give her a new start. It was impossible to ignore. The next morning, Margaret stood nervously at the gates of Jordan's mansion, feeling completely out of place. The iron gates, the perfectly manicured lawn, and the towering mansion made her feel small, but there was no turning back now. Inside, she was greeted by an assistant who led her into Jordan's office. There he was, Jordan Carter, every bit the cold, calculated businessman she imagined. "Sit," he said, his voice devoid of warmth. "Let's discuss the terms." Jordan slid the contract across the desk. Margaret picked it up with shaky hands and began to read. The rules were suffocating. No leaving the house without permission, no personal calls, no emotional involvement. It was clear Jordan wanted this arrangement to be as transactional as possible. "You're paying me to care for your grandmother," Margaret said, her voice sharp. "Is that it?" Jordan looked up, his expression unreadable. "That's it." Every instinct told Margaret to walk away. The man sitting in front of her radiated a kind of emptiness that made her stomach churn. Yet, as her mind drifted back to her eviction notice and her empty fridge, she realized this was her chance, perhaps her only chance, to change her life. "This isn't a job," she finally said. "It's a prison sentence." Jordan raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "A prison that pays well." "You have a choice, Miss Bennett." Margaret left the mansion that day with the contract clutched tightly in her hand. She told herself she wouldn't accept. How could she? The terms were humiliating, and Jordan's cold demeanor made her feel like nothing more than a pawn in his game. But as the hours passed and reality crept back in, Margaret knew she was out of options. Her pride wasn't going to keep her fed, and her stubbornness wouldn't pay the rent. Finally, Margaret picked up the phone and called Jordan's assistant. "Tell him I'll do it," she said, her voice steady but heavy. She had crossed a line she couldn't uncross, stepping into a world that was as unfamiliar as it was dangerous. Margaret didn't know it yet, but that phone call was the beginning of something far greater than a job. It was the start of a journey that would change everything. For her, for Jordan, and for the walls they had spent so long building around themselves. Margaret sat at her tiny kitchen table, the contract spread out before her like a trap. The words stared back at her, cold and binding, each clause tightening the invisible chains she felt wrapping around her freedom. She traced the lines with her fingers, a knot tightening in her chest. No personal connections. No leaving without permission. No questions. It wasn't just a job, it was a surrender. And the man behind it, Jordan Carter, didn't seem to care if she was ready to break apart under its weight. For hours, Margaret battled herself. The money could save her from drowning, but at what cost? A year of her life in exchange for his rigid rules. Was it worth it? Jordan's cold stare haunted her thoughts. Those eyes that seemed to see her as nothing more than a desperate solution to his problem. "I'm not a machine," she whispered to herself, as though trying to convince her reflection in the cracked mirror. "I can't let him own me like this." The memory of her humiliation at the restaurant weighed heavily on her shoulders. Her manager's words, cruel and cutting, still echoed in her mind. "You're replaceable." The truth was that Margaret had spent so much of her life feeling invisible that she feared signing this contract would make it official. She'd become a faceless figure in someone else's life, bound to his rules and nothing more. Was that really any better than the life she was running from? Jordan, on the other hand, sat in his sleek office, his patience beginning to wear thin. He hadn't expected Margaret to hesitate. Most people would have jumped at the opportunity he'd handed her. "It's a fair offer," he muttered under his breath, looking out at the city skyline. And yet, something about her reluctance unsettled him. maybe because it reminded him of something he couldn't quite name. He dismissed the thought immediately. She'll come around, he told himself. That night, Margaret sat on her mattress, surrounded by unpaid bills and eviction notices. It felt like the walls were closing in. She picked up the contract again, tracing the signature line with trembling fingers. No matter how much she fought it, she knew the truth. She didn't have the luxury of saying no. Her pride had carried her this far, but it couldn't carry her any further. I can't keep living like this, she whispered into the empty room. With the sunrise came a heavy resolve. Margaret picked up the phone, her heart pounding in her chest as she dialed the number she'd been given. When Jordan's assistant answered, she swallowed her pride and spoke the words she swore she never would. I'll accept the terms. There was a pause on the other end, followed by a simple, cold response. You start tomorrow. Margaret hung up, feeling both relief and a deep, gnawing fear that she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Jordan, upon receiving the confirmation, didn't smile or celebrate. Instead, he felt a strange unease settle over him. Something about Margaret's hesitation made him question his own decisions. Why had he insisted on this contract? By her. Shaking off the thought, he pushed forward as he always did. To him, everything was under control. But deep down, something told him that this wasn't just another transaction. When Margaret arrived at the mansion the next morning, her heart felt like it might burst from her chest. The grandeur of the place was overwhelming, each detail screaming wealth and power. Jordan met her at the door, his expression unreadable as always. I hope you're ready, he said simply, handing her a set of keys. Margaret took them, her hand shaking slightly. I don't know if anyone could be ready for this, she replied under her breath. Jordan turned away, leaving Margaret to follow him inside. The walls of the mansion felt suffocating, as though they were closing in on her, trapping her in a reality she still wasn't sure she could face. And yet, as she walked through the grand hallways, she felt something strange, like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, about to leap into something she couldn't yet see. Margaret had crossed the line now, whether she was ready or not. The contract was signed, the door had closed behind her, and there was no turning back. Margaret didn't expect Evelyn Carter to be anything more than another part of the job, a woman whose care she'd been hired to ensure. But when she entered Evelyn's room for the first time, the elderly woman looked up at her with eyes full of warmth and wisdom. Ah, you're the one Jordan sent, Evelyn said with a soft smile, her voice kind and steady. Don't look so scared, dear. I don't bite. Margaret couldn't help but smile, a small weight lifting off her shoulders. Evelyn had a presence about her that put Margaret at ease almost instantly. Unlike her grandson, whose gaze felt like ice, Evelyn's demeanor was light and full of life. You remind me of myself when I was younger, Evelyn said one afternoon as Margaret poured her tea. Too stubborn for my own good, but with a heart that always got me in trouble. Margaret laughed softly, though a part of her wondered how Evelyn could see so much in her so quickly. Over the days, Evelyn began sharing stories, memories of love, loss, and rejections she had overcome in her lifetime. Life is just a series of choices, Margaret, Evelyn said one day, looking out at the garden. Sometimes, we let fear make those choices for us. Don't let that happen to you. Margaret held onto those words like a lifeline, surprised by how much they resonated with her. Evelyn, however, wasn't just Margaret's mentor. She also saw through Jordan's carefully constructed walls, and she wasn't afraid to say so. My grandson, he's a good man, but he's too afraid of his own heart, she told Margaret one evening as they sat together. He thinks shutting people out will keep him safe. It won't. Evelyn's gaze was steady, almost knowing, as if she already understood the role Margaret was destined to play in Jordan's life. At first, Margaret brushed off Evelyn's observations about Jordan. She couldn't imagine that the cold, distant man who'd hired her had anything resembling warmth inside him. But as she spent more time with Evelyn, she began to see glimpses, small cracks in Jordan's armor, moments where his carefully curated facade seemed to slip. She started to wonder if there was more to him than he let on. It wasn't just Evelyn's wisdom that changed Margaret, it was her kindness. Evelyn made Margaret feel seen, something she hadn't felt in a long time. You're stronger than you think, Evelyn told her one evening, squeezing Margaret's hand. Don't let anyone, especially yourself, convince you otherwise. It was the kind of validation Margaret didn't realize she had been desperate for, and it gave her a sense of hope she hadn't felt in years. Jordan, though distant, was never far away. He often lingered in doorways or passed by during Evelyn and Margaret's conversations, his expression unreadable. Evelyn noticed, of course. "He's watching you," she said with a teasing grin. "He just doesn't know why yet." Margaret rolled her eyes, brushing it off, but she couldn't deny that Jordan's presence was starting to feel less threatening and more complicated. One afternoon, as Evelyn rested, Margaret found herself sitting in the garden, lost in thought. The mansion felt less suffocating now, and a part of her wondered if she had Evelyn to thank for that. She was learning things about herself, her strength, her worth, that she'd forgotten long ago. And without realizing it, Margaret was starting to feel like she belonged. But Evelyn wasn't finished. "You think you came here because of that contract," she said later that evening, her voice soft but firm. "But that's not the whole story, Margaret. You're here for a reason, one neither you nor Jordan fully understands yet." Margaret blinked, unsettled by the weight of those words. Evelyn smiled knowingly. "Don't worry. You'll see soon enough." Evelyn's words lingered in Margaret's mind that night, a whisper of something bigger that was yet to come. She didn't know what it meant, but something inside her told her that Evelyn was right. Whatever this was, this mansion, this job, even Jordan, was just the beginning of something much greater. Margaret stood at the edge of the grand living room, clutching the contract like a shield. This was it, the point of no return. Jordan had handed her the keys and a folder with detailed rules. "You'll find everything you need here. Just don't stray from what's been agreed," he said, his voice clipped, eyes avoiding hers. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she nodded, wondering what exactly she had gotten herself into. The contract felt like an invisible chain, heavy on her shoulders, and the walls of the mansion seemed to close in around her. Her room, tucked away at the far end of the house, was far from what she'd imagined. It was grand yet impersonal, as if no one had ever truly lived there. The silence was the loudest part, echoing the emptiness that hung in every corner. "One year," she whispered to herself, trying to find comfort in the promise of money that would change everything. But as she unpacked her few belongings, she couldn't shake the feeling of being out of place, like an outsider invading someone else's life. The first day was as cold as the mansion itself. Jordan had vanished into his office, avoiding her completely, leaving only James, the watchful and kind-eyed butler, to show her the ropes. "Don't worry, Miss Margaret," James reassured her. "You'll get used to it here, eventually." But Margaret wasn't so sure. She followed James through hallways lined with paintings of stern-faced ancestors, wondering what kind of life these people had led, and why Jordan seemed to live as though he belonged to their world but had never truly been a part of it. Evelyn, on the other hand, was the complete opposite of her surroundings. The moment Margaret entered her room that first morning, Evelyn beamed, as though she'd been waiting for her. "There you are, dear. I thought you'd never come," she teased, holding her arms open for a gentle hug. Evelyn's warmth caught Margaret off guard. In her presence, the mansion seemed less intimidating. Margaret found herself smiling despite her nerves. For the first time since arriving, she felt a glimmer of hope. But Jordan made sure to remind Margaret of the invisible lines she wasn't allowed to cross. That evening, as she passed him in the hallway, she tried to engage him with a polite good night. He didn't stop walking, barely sparing her a glance. "Don't forget why you're here," he said, his tone as cold as ice. The sting of his words lingered long after he disappeared down the corridor. It was clear, she was an employee, nothing more. And Jordan was determined to keep it that way. The days settled into a rhythm, caring for Evelyn, adhering to Jordan's strict rules, and slowly exploring the mansion's many secrets. Margaret was tested daily by Evelyn's illness, the emotional weight of caring for someone so fragile, and Jordan's constant cold presence lingering in the background. Yet, Evelyn's company was a balm for her soul. She shared stories of her past, her voice full of laughter, as if she'd lived several lifetimes. "Life doesn't wait for us to be ready, dear. Sometimes, you just have to step into the unknown and hope for the best." Margaret realized she was starting to care more than she'd intended, about Evelyn, about this strange life she was now a part of. But the rules were clear: no connections. Don't get comfortable, she reminded herself often. Yet it was hard not to notice the moments when Jordan would linger in the shadows, watching her interact with Evelyn. His face was unreadable, but Margaret felt as though he was fighting something invisible, something only he could see. Her biggest challenge came when Evelyn had a rough day. Margaret sat beside her, holding her frail hand, unsure of what to do. "You're doing just fine," Evelyn whispered, as though reading her thoughts. When Margaret left the room that evening, she bumped into Jordan. "She trusts you," he said suddenly, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "Don't let her down." The vulnerability in his words caught Margaret by surprise. For the first time, Jordan didn't seem like the cold, untouchable businessman she thought he was. But every step forward felt like walking on thin ice. The weight of the contract was always there, a reminder that this wasn't her life, that this world wasn't truly hers to belong to. Late at night, Margaret would lie awake, wondering what she was doing. Was this the right choice? Would Jordan cast her aside when her role was done? The uncertainty gnawed at her, but she refused to let it break her. One day at a time, she told herself. Margaret had crossed the first threshold into this new life, and though it was filled with walls, both literal and emotional, she could feel something shifting. The mansion no longer felt quite as cold, Evelyn no longer seemed like just a responsibility, and Jordan was becoming less of a mystery and more of a question she wasn't ready to answer. And yet, Margaret knew one thing for certain: there was no turning back now. The days inside the mansion began to blur into a strange new routine for Margaret. The work of caring for Evelyn was demanding, both physically and emotionally. Some mornings, Evelyn would be full of life, recounting stories of her youth with a gleam in her eyes. Other days, her frailty was a stark reminder of how little time she had left. Margaret found herself holding back tears more often than she cared to admit, but she never let Evelyn see them. She had made a promise to be strong, for both of them. Evelyn quickly became Margaret's greatest ally. She wasn't just the woman Margaret was hired to care for. She was a mentor, a confidant, and the only person in the house who made Margaret feel truly seen. "You remind me of someone I used to know," Evelyn said one day, her voice soft but knowing. "Someone who didn't know how strong she really was. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." Margaret held on to those words, replaying them in her mind whenever she doubted herself. Another unexpected ally was James, the butler. With his quiet presence and subtle wisdom, he became Margaret's guide through the maze of life inside the mansion. "Jordan's not as heartless as he pretends to be," James told her one afternoon, catching her watching Jordan from across the hall. "But you'll need patience to see that." His words surprised Margaret, but deep down she knew James was right. Jordan's cold demeanor felt like armor, but even the strongest armor had cracks. Jordan, however, was still Margaret's biggest challenge, and her most complicated enemy. He never raised his voice or made cruel remarks, but his indifference cut deeper than any insult. His rules were clear: Margaret was an employee, nothing more. Yet, there were moments when she caught him watching her, his expression unreadable. And in those fleeting seconds, Margaret wondered what he was hiding beneath all that control. Margaret's greatest test came during a particularly difficult night. Evelyn was in pain, her breathing shallow, and Margaret didn't know what to do. She felt helpless, like she was failing. "You're not alone," James reassured her, placing a hand on her shoulder. It was then that Margaret realized the truth: this wasn't just a job anymore. She cared about Evelyn, and that terrified her. Because caring meant losing control, and losing control meant risking everything. Jordan remained distant but present, like a shadow lurking in the corners. One evening, as Margaret sat with Evelyn, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to see Jordan standing in the doorway, watching. "Is she okay?" he asked softly, the concern in his voice catching her off guard. "She's resting," Margaret replied. For the first time, Jordan didn't walk away. He stayed, just for a moment, before disappearing back into his world of silence. The days became a series of quiet victories and small defeats. Margaret learned to navigate Jordan's moods, rely on James's quiet support, and draw strength from Evelyn's wisdom. Yet, deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was building, like the calm before a storm. The mansion held secrets, and Margaret was beginning to feel like she was at the center of something far bigger than herself. The air in the mansion had changed. The once cold and lifeless hallways now carried an undercurrent of tension, as if everyone was waiting for something inevitable to happen. Margaret noticed Evelyn's health declining little by little, and though the older woman never complained, Margaret could see the exhaustion in her eyes. "It's coming, dear," Evelyn whispered one afternoon as Margaret adjusted her pillows. "You'll need to be strong for him. For both of you." The words sent a chill through Margaret. What did she mean by that? The strain on Margaret grew heavier with every passing day. She would sit with Evelyn for hours, talking, reading, or just holding her hand in silence. The bond between them had deepened into something Margaret hadn't anticipated. It felt like family. But the more she cared, the more the reality of losing Evelyn loomed over her. And worse, she saw Jordan avoiding his grandmother altogether, burying himself deeper into his work. It infuriated her. "You can't hide forever," she muttered one evening, watching him through the study's glass door. Jordan, for all his indifference, was unraveling. Margaret could see it. His silence wasn't just avoidance, it was fear. He would linger in the hallway outside Evelyn's room but never enter, like a man afraid to confront a part of himself he couldn't control. One night, Margaret confronted him. "She's getting worse, Jordan. She needs you." He didn't meet her eyes, his jaw tight. "I'm doing what's best for her. She doesn't need to see me like this." Margaret shook her head. "She needs to see you care. Isn't that more important?" The confrontation left a crack in Jordan's armor. He started showing up in small, quiet ways, peeking into Evelyn's room, leaving flowers on her bedside table, or standing in the doorway while Margaret read to her. But every step closer seemed to cost him something. It was as if facing Evelyn's illness forced him to face every loss he'd ever buried. Margaret saw it, and for the first time, she began to understand him. Jordan wasn't heartless. He was terrified of caring and losing again. Then, Margaret made a discovery that shifted everything. While cleaning Evelyn's room, she found an old journal tucked away in a drawer. It was filled with letters Evelyn had written to Jordan but never sent. They spoke of love, regret, and her sadness at seeing him shut the world out. "You're stronger than you know, Jordan," one letter read. "But strength doesn't come from walls. It comes from opening your heart, even when it hurts." Margaret held the pages tightly, tears welling in her eyes. Jordan needed to see this. That night, Margaret found Jordan in his study, hunched over his desk with a drink in his hand. "You need to read this," she said, placing the journal in front of him. Jordan looked at it like it might burn him. "What is this?" "It's from her," Margaret replied, her voice soft but firm. "Everything she's wanted to say to you. Please, don't ignore it." For a moment, Jordan stared at the journal as if it held all his fears. Finally, he pushed it away. "I don't need to read it. I already know what it says." Margaret's patience broke. "No, you don't. You've spent your entire life running, Jordan. From her, from yourself, from anything that makes you feel. And now, when you have a chance to make things right, you're just going to throw it away." Her voice trembled, but she didn't stop. "She loves you. She always has. And if you don't show her you love her too, you're going to regret it for the rest of your life." Jordan looked up at her then, and for the first time, Margaret saw it, the pain he had spent years trying to bury. Jordan didn't say a word, but when Margaret left the study, she hoped, prayed, that she had gotten through to him. Outside Evelyn's room, she paused, placing her hand on the door. Inside, Evelyn lay peacefully, unaware of the battle happening just beyond her walls. Margaret exhaled a shaky breath, knowing that the hardest part was still to come. The walls Jordan had spent years building were finally starting to crack, and all Margaret could do was hope he would let them crumble completely. It happened in the middle of the night. Evelyn's frail voice called out softly, waking Margaret from a restless sleep. When Margaret entered her room, she found her breathing shallow, her skin pale. Margaret's heart clenched as she knelt beside her, taking Evelyn's hand. "It's okay, I'm here," she whispered, fighting back tears. Evelyn smiled faintly, her eyes glimmering even in the darkness. "You're a good girl, Margaret. Don't let him forget how to love. Margaret's chest tightened, but before she could respond, Evelyn's breathing grew weaker. Margaret knew she couldn't handle this alone. She ran to Jordan's door, banging on it with urgency. "Jordan, you need to come now." It took him a moment to open, his face pale and confused. "What's wrong?" "It's Evelyn," Margaret choked out, grabbing his wrist. "Please." Something in her voice broke through to him, and without another word, he followed her down the hall. When they entered Evelyn's room, Jordan froze. He looked at his grandmother, fragile and small, and for the first time in years, he didn't know what to do. "Sit with her," Margaret urged softly, guiding him to Evelyn's bedside. Jordan hesitated, his face etched with panic. "I don't know if I can." "You can," Margaret interrupted. "She needs you now, Jordan. And you need this too." He swallowed hard, then sat, his hand trembling as he reached for Evelyn's. Her eyes fluttered open, and when she saw him, her expression softened into a tired smile. "You came," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jordan blinked back tears, nodding. "I'm sorry, Grandma. I should have been here sooner." Margaret watched from the corner of the room, her heart breaking and healing all at once. Jordan, the man who had built walls around his heart, was finally letting himself feel. Evelyn's fingers curled weakly around his, and she murmured something only he could hear. A tear slipped down Jordan's cheek, but he didn't look away, didn't pull back. He held her hand as she drifted into unconsciousness, staying with her until her breathing slowed and the room fell silent. Evelyn was gone. The weight of the moment settled over them like a blanket. Jordan didn't move, his shoulders shaking as he silently wept. Margaret approached him slowly, placing a gentle hand on his back. "You were here," she whispered. "She knew you loved her." Jordan didn't respond, but when he looked up, his expression was raw and unguarded. "I was too late," he said, his voice breaking. "No," Margaret replied softly. "You were right on time." The hours that followed were a blur. The mansion felt emptier than ever, as if Evelyn's absence had drained the warmth from its walls. Jordan disappeared into his study, leaving Margaret to grieve in her own way. She sat in Evelyn's room, surrounded by her belongings, trying to find comfort in the memories they'd shared. But the hardest part was knowing that nothing she could say or do would take away Jordan's pain. That evening, Margaret found Jordan sitting in the dark, staring at the journal she had given him days before. "I read it," he said quietly as she entered. "Every word." Margaret sat beside him, waiting. "She deserved so much better than what I gave her," Jordan admitted, his voice shaking. "But you gave her something," Margaret replied, her tone gentle. "You were there when it mattered most. That's what she'll take with her." Jordan nodded, but the guilt lingered in his eyes. As they sat in silence, Margaret realized something. This was Jordan's turning point. He had faced his greatest fear, loss, and survived it. He had shown up, been vulnerable, and let himself care. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Margaret reached for his hand, squeezing it softly. "You're not alone, Jordan," she whispered. He looked at her, truly looked at her, for what felt like the first time. And in that moment, Margaret knew that neither of them would ever be the same again. The mansion was quieter than ever after Evelyn's passing. Her absence was a void that could be felt in every room, every corner where her presence had once brought warmth. For days, Jordan retreated into himself, disappearing into his study and leaving Margaret to wander the house alone. But something had changed. The walls Jordan had built around himself were no longer impenetrable. Margaret could see the cracks. The silence was no longer cold, it was heavy, as if he were wrestling with the weight of his grief, his regrets, and the new emotions he could no longer bury. Margaret didn't leave. She couldn't. There was no longer a contract binding her to that house, but something deeper kept her there. She stayed not because she had to, but because she wanted to. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the garden, Margaret found Jordan standing near Evelyn's favorite chair, staring out at the horizon. "Why are you still here?" he asked, his voice rough but quiet. "You don't have to be." Margaret hesitated, then spoke with surprising steadiness. "Because you're not the only one who's grieving." Jordan turned to look at her, really look at her, for the first time in days. The cold mask he had always worn was gone, replaced by something softer, something real. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, his voice breaking slightly. "I don't know how to move forward." Margaret stepped closer, meeting his gaze. "You don't have to know. You just have to try." She reached out and took his hand, a simple gesture that carried more weight than words ever could. And Jordan didn't pull away. The next morning, Jordan surprised Margaret. She found him sitting in the dining room, looking at a small box. "These were Evelyn's wishes," he said, pushing the box toward her. Inside were papers, handwritten letters, and a plan Evelyn had started, transforming the mansion into a home for those who had nowhere else to go. "She wanted this place to mean something," Jordan explained, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "And I want to make it happen. For her." Margaret's heart swelled as she looked at him. This was the Jordan Carter she had glimpsed only in fleeting moments. A man who cared deeply but had been too afraid to show it. "You can't do this alone," Margaret said softly, closing the box. "And you don't have to." Jordan's lips curved into the smallest of smiles. "I know. That's why I need you here." It wasn't a plea, nor an order. It was a simple truth. They were in this together. Over the next few weeks, the mansion began to change. What was once a cold and lifeless house transformed into something full of hope and purpose. Jordan and Margaret worked side by side, planning every detail. Jordan used his resources to fund the renovations, while Margaret poured her heart into making the space welcoming. It was hard work, but it was rewarding. For the first time, Jordan wasn't running from his feelings, he was facing them. And Margaret felt something she hadn't in years: belonging. One night, after hours of planning, Jordan and Margaret sat on the steps of the mansion, looking out at the garden bathed in moonlight. "I thought money was all that mattered," Jordan admitted quietly. "But Evelyn was right. None of this means anything if you have no one to share it with." Margaret turned to him, her expression soft. "You're starting to get it," she said with a small smile. "Life isn't about what you have. It's about what you give." Jordan looked at her then, and there was no distance between them. No walls, no rules, no cold detachment. "Thank you," he said, the words simple but full of meaning. Margaret shook her head gently. "You don't have to thank me, Jordan. This is you. This is us." The air between them shifted, heavy with everything unsaid but understood. For the first time, Jordan allowed himself to believe that he wasn't alone, that maybe, just maybe, he could trust someone with his heart. It wasn't just the mansion that was changing, it was them. Margaret, who had arrived feeling small and invisible, now stood tall, knowing her worth. And Jordan, who had lived his life avoiding pain, now found himself walking through it, hand in hand with someone who refused to let him go. They weren't perfect, but they were real. And that was enough. As the renovations neared completion, Jordan handed Margaret an envelope one evening. "Your payment," he said, almost hesitantly. Margaret frowned, confused. "Jordan, no," he interrupted softly. "It's not what you think. I want you to take it, but only because I don't want you to feel like you owe me anything. You stayed because you wanted to. And I want you to stay, because I want you to." Margaret stared at him, tears filling her eyes, realizing how far he had come. The reward they had found wasn't the project itself, or the success of Evelyn's dream, it was each other. For Margaret, it was the realization that she deserved to be seen and valued. For Jordan, it was the courage to finally let someone in. Together, they had seized something priceless, a connection built not on contracts or obligations, but on trust, respect, and love. The mansion was no longer a symbol of cold indifference. Where once there was silence, now there were voices, footsteps, and the hum of life filling every room. The Casa Evelyn project was in full swing, with workers buzzing around as they transformed the house into a home for those in need. The blueprint Evelyn had started, and that Jordan and Margaret had brought to life, was nearly complete. But the closer they got to their goal, the more Margaret and Jordan realized that the hardest part wasn't the work, it was learning to face what came after. Margaret stood in the main hall one afternoon, watching the workers bring in furniture. Sunlight poured through the windows, making the room feel brighter than it ever had. Jordan stood beside her, his hands in his pockets, a faint smile on his lips. It doesn't feel like the same house, Margaret said softly. Jordan looked at her and nodded. Because it isn't. And neither are we. His words held a quiet weight, a truth both of them had come to accept. Still, the path forward wasn't without its struggles. As the days grew busier, Margaret felt an old insecurity creeping in. The closer they got to the grand opening of Casa Evelyn, the more she feared that her role in Jordan's life would fade. The mansion was almost finished. What was left for her to do? "You won't need me anymore," she whispered to herself late one night, sitting alone in her room. But the thought hurt more than it should have. Jordan, too, felt the shift. As the house transformed, he started questioning everything. He wasn't used to feeling this way, vulnerable, exposed, and unsure of where things stood. Margaret had stayed after Evelyn's passing, but what was keeping her now? What if she leaves? The thought haunted him, a fear he hadn't felt in years. He realized that, for the first time, he wanted someone to stay, not out of obligation, but because they chose to. And that scared him more than he cared to admit. One evening, Margaret was organizing donations in the main room when Jordan appeared in the doorway. He watched her for a moment before speaking. "You've done a lot for this place." Margaret smiled faintly. "We both have." Jordan hesitated, then stepped closer. "Do you ever think about leaving?" he asked abruptly. The question caught Margaret off guard. "Why would I?" Jordan shrugged, his voice quieter. "Because you can. There's no contract holding you here anymore." Margaret set down the box she was holding and looked at him. "I don't stay because of a contract, Jordan. I stay because I want to. Because this matters to me." Jordan's shoulders relaxed, but the look in his eyes was still guarded. "What happens when this is finished? When you don't need to stay anymore?" Margaret took a deep breath, understanding the real question he was asking. "Then I'll stay because you matter to me." Her words hung in the air, soft but unshakable. For Jordan, those words were a turning point. He realized that all the walls he had built were no longer necessary. Margaret wasn't going anywhere, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. That night, he joined her in the study, where they pored over final plans for the opening. It was a quiet moment, but one filled with unspoken understanding. They were building something much bigger than a shelter. They were building a life together, whether they realized it or not. The opening day of Casa Evelyn arrived, and the mansion was transformed into a home of warmth and love. The first group of residents began moving in, their faces lighting up with gratitude as they explored the space. Margaret watched from the doorway, tears brimming in her eyes. "We did it," she whispered, almost to herself. Jordan, standing beside her, nodded. "She would have loved this." His voice was steady, but Margaret could hear the emotion behind it. As the day wound down, Jordan found Margaret in the garden, sitting on Evelyn's old bench. "I don't think I've ever thanked you properly," he said, sitting beside her. Margaret turned to him, surprised. "For what?" Jordan looked at her, his expression soft. "For showing me what mattered. For staying even when I didn't deserve it." Margaret smiled, shaking her head. "You didn't need to deserve it, Jordan. You just needed to believe you were worth it." The mansion was no longer just a place, it was a legacy. A symbol of hope, connection, and transformation. For Jordan and Margaret, it was also a reflection of their journey, messy, imperfect, but undeniably beautiful. As they sat together under the stars, Jordan took Margaret's hand in his, a silent promise that neither of them would ever have to walk alone again. The days following the grand opening of Casa Evelyn were quieter, but not in the same cold, empty way they had been before. The mansion was alive now, filled with laughter, soft conversations, and the warmth of people who finally felt they had a place to belong. For Margaret and Jordan, this new chapter felt surreal, like the closing of a long, exhausting storm. But with the calm came a new reality, one that tested just how far they had come on their journey. Jordan, despite his transformation, still carried remnants of his old self, the man who feared loss, who shut people out to protect himself. It happened on a rainy afternoon. Margaret found him alone in his study, staring at Evelyn's photo on the desk, his face shadowed with doubt. "What if I can't keep this going?" he asked suddenly, his voice low. "What if I fail her? What if I fail you?" Margaret stepped into the room, unshaken. You won't fail, Jordan. But even if you stumble, you're not alone anymore. Her words were a balm, but Jordan still struggled to accept them fully. Old habits died hard, and part of him still feared the weight of responsibility that came with caring for something and someone so deeply. You've changed so much, Margaret said softly, watching him. But change doesn't mean you won't feel afraid. It just means you don't let fear win. Jordan looked at her, searching her face as though trying to find something he couldn't quite say. For Margaret, this was her resurrection too. The woman who once believed she was small, invisible, and replaceable now stood tall, a pillar of strength not only for herself but for Jordan. She no longer second-guessed her worth. The mansion wasn't her prison anymore. It was her home, and the people inside it were her family. The old Margaret would have run at the first sign of doubt, but this Margaret stayed because she knew she was enough. Jordan, finally, let his walls come down completely. One evening, as they sat in the garden, he turned to her, his voice quiet but steady. "You saved me, Margaret." She smiled, shaking her head. "I didn't save you, Jordan. You did that yourself. I just reminded you of what was already there." He paused, taking her hand gently in his. "Then let me say it differently. You made me want to be better. You gave me a reason to try." The bond between them had been forged in grief, struggle, and countless unspoken moments. They had walked through their darkest fears together and emerged stronger. Jordan no longer feared letting people in, and Margaret no longer feared being left behind. Together, they were building something real, a partnership based not on contracts or obligations, but on trust, respect, and love. And that love was tested in the small, everyday moments. Jordan would still retreat into his thoughts sometimes, but now Margaret knew how to bring him back. "You're not alone anymore," she would remind him softly, and every time he believed her a little more. Likewise, when Margaret doubted herself or questioned her place in his world, Jordan was there to steady her. "You belong here," he'd say. "With me." Their resurrection wasn't about perfection. It was about choosing each other every day, even when the doubts crept in. It was about creating a life together, piece by piece, out of the brokenness they had both carried for so long. Evelyn's legacy wasn't just the mansion, it was the way she had brought them together, showing them what it meant to love and be loved in return. One evening, as they stood watching the sunset from the balcony, Jordan wrapped his arm around Margaret. "I think she knew," he said softly. "Evelyn, I think she always knew we'd end up here." Margaret smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "She was smarter than both of us put together," she teased. Jordan laughed softly, a sound that was still new but so natural. "And she'd be happy to see us figuring it out." The mansion was no longer just a house. It was a place of hope, healing, and second chances. And for Jordan and Margaret, it was proof that even the deepest wounds could heal, that resurrection was possible, not because life was easy, but because they had chosen to fight for it. Together, the mansion was no longer a place of loneliness and regret. Casa Evelyn had become a sanctuary, a place where lives were rebuilt and where second chances weren't just words but tangible realities. Laughter echoed through the hallways, voices hummed in the common rooms, and the garden Evelyn loved so much was now alive with residents finding peace among the flowers. It was everything Jordan and Margaret had worked for, a legacy that honored Evelyn's spirit and the lessons she left behind. Jordan stood in the doorway of the garden one afternoon, watching Margaret as she helped an elderly woman plant new tulips. She was smiling, her sleeves rolled up and her hair falling loosely around her face. It struck him then, how much light she brought into the lives of everyone she met, including his own. "You're staring," Margaret teased, catching him in the corner of her eye. Jordan smirked softly, walking toward her. "I'm just making sure you're doing it right," he replied, crouching down to help her. They worked in silence for a moment before Jordan spoke again. "She'd be proud, you know, of you." Margaret looked up at him, her expression softening. "She'd be proud of us, Jordan. We did this together." Jordan paused, letting the words settle. "I used to think everything I touched would end up broken," he admitted. "But this is different?" Margaret smiled, wiping dirt from her hands. "Because you let yourself believe in it." Jordan's journey had come full circle. The man who once saw money as his only shield now understood that his true wealth lay in the connections he nurtured and the life he was building. For Margaret, the mansion wasn't just a place she had stumbled into, it was proof of how far she had come. She was no longer the woman afraid of being invisible. Here she was seen, valued, and loved. And for the first time, she could look at herself and see someone strong, someone capable of creating something that mattered. Months later, Casa Evelyn hosted its first big celebration, a garden party filled with residents, staff, and friends. The house buzzed with joy, the kind Evelyn herself would have brought. Margaret moved through the crowd, making sure everyone had what they needed, her laughter ringing like a melody. Jordan watched her from a distance, pride swelling in his chest. "You really have changed, sir," James, the ever-watchful butler, said beside him. Jordan glanced at him with a small smile. "I finally had the right reason to." When the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting everything in shades of gold, Margaret and Jordan found themselves standing at the edge of the garden, watching the party unfold. "This is just the beginning," Margaret murmured, her voice filled with hope. Jordan turned to her, his expression steady but warm. "For the house." "For us," he said, reaching for her hand. Margaret smiled, squeezing it gently. "Evelyn would say it's about time." Jordan chuckled, nodding. "She always knew better than we did." Margaret looked at him, her eyes shimmering. Maybe she knew that some things, the best things, take time. And for a moment, there was nothing but silence between them, the kind of silence that speaks more than words ever could. They had walked through loss, fear, and doubt, only to find that love, real love, was worth every step of the journey. The mansion had given Jordan and Margaret more than a purpose. It had given them a home, a future, and a shared dream that they could keep building brick by brick. They weren't perfect, and life wasn't free of struggles. But they had each other, and that made all the difference. Casa Evelyn wasn't just Evelyn's legacy anymore. It was theirs. A place of hope, love, and second chances, not just for those who entered its doors, but for the two of them too. As the first stars began to appear overhead, Jordan pulled Margaret closer, resting his forehead against hers. "We made it," he whispered. Margaret smiled, her heart full. "We did. And we're just getting started." Together, they had returned from the depths of their struggles, not just alive, but reborn. The elixir they carried was more powerful than wealth or success. It was the knowledge that love, the kind you fight for, the kind you choose every day, was the greatest reward of all.